Hi, I'm Lorraine Lorraine the Lawyer, here today to provide a synopsis of the Brittney Griner current trial and imprisonment in Russia currently. Let's start off by going over a timeline of the events. Brittney Griner is a 2-time U.S. Olympic gold medalist and an 8-time WNBA All-Star player that is currently detained in Russia on charges of having vape cartridges that were filled with hashish oil in her luggage at Moscow Sheremetyevo airport. And, Brittney Griner is really started this detainment on February 17th while attempting to enter, and the customs officials apparently found these vape cartridges that were filled with hashish oil in her luggage. Brittney was returning to Russia to play for her Russian professional team, UMMC Ekaterinburg, which she plays for in the WNBA offseason. And the arrest is really not made public for nearly 3 weeks as of that February 17th date of her detainment. In February 24th, Russia at that exact time also invaded the Ukraine, and the U.S. began to provide the Ukraine with military aid and imposed at the same time sanctions on Russia. In March 5, the Russian state news agency TASS identified Griner as having been detained after the Russian Federal Customs Service said that they detained a 2-time Olympic basketball champion in the U.S. team. The contents of the vape cartridges were then identified as cannabis oil. On March 6, the U.S. State Department held a press briefing where a general reference was made to Americans being held in Russia and a U.S. Embassy team working to ensure their rights are upheld and respected were mentioned, of course, in this briefing. On March 17th, a Russian court then extended Griner's pre-trial detention until May 19th. So that was March 17th, and then the announcement was made to extend her pre-trial detention until May 19th. The U.S. Embassy also then claims that they are being detained consular access to meet with Griner. The U.S. Embassy then claimed that they were being denied consular access to meet with Griner. On March 23rd, the embassy officials were then allowed to meet with Griner in custody and described her as being in good condition. Shortly thereafter, actually a month later, April 27, another American that was classified by the U.S. State Department as wrongfully detained in Russia was then freed in a prisoner swap. A couple of weeks later, the U.S. State Department classified Brittney Griner as wrongfully detained, and this allowed a new team in the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs in the U.S. State Department to take up the case. On May 6th, the WNBA season began, and we saw decals appear on the court with big capitalized BG42, obviously Brittney Griner's number, as well as fans wearing supportive pins and t-shirts, and many WNBA players wearing "We Are BG" shirts. May 25, Brittney Griner's wife, Cherelle Griner, appeared on national media asking Joe Biden to do something to bring Brittney home. And on June 13th, the U.S. State Department officials met with members of Griner's team, the Phoenix Mercury, but at that time, no new details were released. On June 27th, a Russian judge then set a trial date of July 1st and extended Griner's detention another 6 months. On July 1st, Griner trial then opened with the unsealing of the prosecution's case against Griner, as well as testimony from customs officers who discovered the hashish oil, and then alleged that hashish oil was for personal use and measured at 0.252 grams and 0.45 grams, respectively. On July 4th, portions of the letter that Griner wrote to President Biden were then released, where then she made clear in her statement that she was fearful and scared in the Russian prison. and asked for help. On July 6, Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris speak with Griner's wife, Cherelle Griner, by phone and reassure her that they are working on the case. On July 7th, Griner then pleads guilty to drug charges in Russia and says that she accidentally, had no intent, accidentally packed the vape cartridges in her luggage. Griner then pled guilty, but made it clear again that she had no intent to break the law. At that time, some Russian legal experts speculated that this may be a tool to get a little bit more of a lenient sentence. On July 15th, Griner's Russian lawyer argues that Griner's physician recommended medical marijuana for Griner and that this was legal under Arizona law. On July 26th, Griner's next court date, with an expected wrap-up date to be in August. On July 27th, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said that weeks ago, the U.S. government put a substantial proposal on the table to the Russian government to bring Brittney Griner home. While really no specifics had been provided, it's believed that this is a deal to swap a convicted arms dealer by the name of Victor Bout, who is now serving 25 years in federal prison on weapons smuggling charges, for Brittney Griner and another American detained in Russia. Blinken expects to follow up with the Russian government in the following days to try and work out the deals of the offer. Brittney Griner also appeared in a Russian court on July 27th. This time, she was testifying further at her trial, including making the claim that the conversation with customs agents at the airport wasn't translated fully or properly, and she didn't understand what she was even being asked or what she was signing. She claims also not to have been advised of her rights, or at least to not have understood them, as well as being detained, as well as being denied an attorney at that time. So she claimed also not to have been advised of her rights, not to have understood them at the time, as well as not being properly given and also denied an attorney at that time. So this begs, I think, a big question about the U.S. Embassy and what the U.S. Embassy can do to help detained citizens abroad. It's important to really remember that a U.S. citizen is subject to foreign laws while overseas, and no matter how draconian that those might be, and how absolutely different they may be from our democratic processes, in the case of arrest, the U.S. State Department is limited in how it can help U.S. citizens. U.S. citizens then are advised to contact the closest U.S. embassy after an arrest and alert them to the situation. So in Brittney Griner's situation, this was what was available to her. Number one, to provide a list, the embassy could provide a list of local attorneys who could speak English, to contact family or friends in the U.S., to visit the detained citizen and ensure they're getting proper medical care, and give a general overview of the criminal process, establish a trust so that friends and family can transfer money to the detained citizen. What they can't do is, I'm sure, what so many in Brittney's camp wanted so badly to do to help her, get her out of jail. Number one, advocate as an attorney or provide legal advice for the citizen, and represent to a court if the citizen is innocent or guilty, and serve as interpreters. Pay legal fees, medical or other fees. So none of that the embassy could do. While Griner had been playing in Russia for several years, she traveled there during a time, and we should note that the State Department had slapped Russia with a level 4 do not travel advisory warning. It specifically also mentioned in that travel advisory that U.S. citizens were likely in this state being harassed by government security officials, as well as U.S. citizens were being singled out for detention, arbitrary enforcement of local laws, and even wrongful detentions. The ability of U.S. embassy officials to then meet with detained Americans at that time would have been extremely and severely limited. So how is it that we have seen Brittney Griner in this situation? So how is it that we have seen Brittney Griner and we find ourselves in this observance of Brittney Griner in this situation? Perhaps it's a reflection of the reality of WNBA players needing to play in other countries. While Brittney Griner is a gold medal Olympian and really well-known athlete, the reality is that WNBA players, while Brittney Griner is a gold medal Olympian and a very well-known athlete, the reality is that WNBA players earn so much less than their male counterparts in the NBA. As of 2020, the stat is that the average base NBA salary is $5.4 million, while the average base WNBA player salary is under $121,000. So if the WNBA season has 36 games and the NBA season on average is 82 games, comparing those base salaries, we are averaging an NBA player making 44 times what a WNBA player makes. The WNBA also plays in the summertime, which is typically not the American market season to be watching basketball. So with this disparity, how many more WNBA players would need to play overseas in the off season to just make ends meet and to stay in practice, stay in training, keep up with that grueling schedule? This means that female players are heading to some destinations which would have very different laws than in the United States and a lot less protection, like, for example, Turkey, China, of course, Russia. And these are some of the top destinations that the WNBA players are going to. Griner, for example, had played previously in China before joining the UMMC Ekaterinburg team. For how many WNBA players, overseas play is actually where they make the majority of their paycheck, with some US talent actually sitting out WNBA seasons so they defer those paychecks in order to play overseas as they make substantially larger paychecks. So one possible observation, perhaps, we could derive from this is that so long as WNBA does not pay enough for many of its players to even take first-class domestic flights, many of whom are well over 6 feet players, that WNBA players will then continue to head overseas to countries with such strict laws, where WNBA players are then given little guidance about local customs laws or rights. I think that this is probably most illustrated in the New York Liberty team owner, Joe Size, who was fined $500,000 by the WNBA for simply chartering flights for his team members, making sure they got on time for their games, making sure they were protected. While this is the norm in the NBA, in the WNBA, this was considered and treated as a violation of collective bargaining agreement. So Brittney Griner and other WNBA players in the geopolitical scheme, I think we really need to take a step back and think about that. One nagging question that we have is, why is the WNBA pay so much lower in the US, but so much higher in places like Russia? The answer, some have stated, which could be extreme, is pointing to money laundering. Anecdotal evidence suggests that a number of teams that WNBA players play for, especially in Russia, are owned by oligarchs, many of whom are looking for ways, it is claimed, to launder ill-gotten funds into legitimate businesses. And the claims are looking at reports of few ticket sales, near empty arenas, and extremely cheap tickets, tending to lead credence to this argument then. Griner's team, UMMC Ekaterinburg, is owned by a Russian oligarch and his mining corporation. So this claim that we hear also puts forth that potentially a corrupt environment where vulnerable players like Griner are sent perhaps this is all fertile ground, is they cannot make enough playing in relatively safer environment back in the US. So Brittney Griner and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine should be another step that we need to take a look at here. Brittney Griner and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine should also be another factor here and circumstances that we need to take pause and think about. While getting targeted for a drug arrest in a foreign country is never good news, getting targeted in Russia right before the planned invasion of the Ukraine carries far more risks for Griner. She's a high-profile target with a large fan base in the US, and as such could be really considered a useful tool for Russia. One opinion could be that Brittney Griner could be a useful pawn for Russian propaganda, in that perhaps it could distract American audiences away from what is happening in the Ukraine. It could be useful to use the promise of Griner's freedom as a way to keep American criticism of Russian conduct in the Ukraine muted. Russia could use, as another opinion as well, is that Russia could use Griner as a bargaining chip in order to extract a degree of leverage over the US to alleviate some of the sanctions that the US has imposed. Her release may cast Russia as a humane country and counteract US claims about Russian aggression and alleged war crimes. Another opinion. Thirdly, Russia could be sending a message that they will be less tolerant of certain practices, certain things, certain customs, certain rights. A last opinion could be that Russia may be sending a message they will be less tolerant of what is the claim to be undesirables Lastly, an opinion could be that Russia may be sending a message that they are less tolerant of what Americans are currently accepting, such as Griner, who is now openly gay. Russia is not known for its tolerance of homosexuality, and Griner's arrest may be signaling a return to Russian nationalism and traditional Russian values, more in line with an authoritarian regime led by Vladimir Putin. In other words, Putin may want to remove high-profile American influences in Russia, especially ones like Griner, who openly espouse homosexuality. So what are the strategies and pitfalls of a guilty plea for Griner? On July 7th, Griner pleaded guilty to her charges, asking the court for leniency by saying she only had them for personal use and that she was completely unaware that they were in her baggage. In the Russian legal system, a guilty plea actually does not end the trial. The evidence and the entire case must be read into the record, and in Griner's case, this may take several more weeks. While this move surprised many in the US, it seems to be a tactical move on her part, Griner's part. For the first instance here, the Russian legal system has been described as more and claimed as more a theater than fairness, since conviction rates approach 99%. A guilty plea seems like just a realistic handling of the situation then for Griner. Rather than have a trial for a foregone conclusion, just plead guilty and shorten the whole process. Russian sources, on the other hand, have really bitten back on that and say that disparaging comments about the Russian legal system and Russia's legitimate interest in enforcing its drug laws don't help the diplomatic behind the scenes talk that are absolutely no doubt happening right now regarding Griner's case. Russian sources have even said that until Griner's trial is over, there's not going to be any further public discussion about whether or not Russia would be open to prisoner swap. Also, in order to save face, it just makes sense, it seems, that for Russia to secure a guilty plea for Griner, where she would then admit guilt, would then justify her intention in the first place. Then Russia could be able to then send her home as part of a prisoner swap and look quite good in that regard, come out on top. Russia seems to be interested in obtaining the release of a Russian arms dealer, Victor Bout, who is serving 25 years in U.S. custody. He's this, on the other hand, for Brittney Griner, she's a high-profile, popular, and sympathetic character, would be the perfect candidate for a swap. So then, on a practical level, the guilty plea also serves as a way to mitigate a potential 10-year sentence. And Griner's lawyer in Russia has said that she believes a guilty plea will be taken into consideration quite favorably by the court. It's therefore easy to then see Griner pleading guilty, the court taking this into consideration, since this is also a first offense, sentencing her to a short term or just straight up deporting her, especially if a prisoner swap had been arranged quietly in the meantime. So this could allow a string of Russian supporters like her UMMC team doctor to testify to Griner's good character, including the fact that she had been drug tested numerous times and had never failed a test, therefore making the claim that this was a one-off accident and should be treated as such. But then on the flip side, if she does plead guilty, and she has, but on the flip side, she has pled guilty. So the court also could just turn around and force a sentence for the maximum period of time. And that could be dependent on the overall mood in Russia and whether or not those bitter relations between Russia and the U.S. have all improved or changed since the invasion in the Ukraine. Unfortunately for Griner, she really is stuck, it appears, between two major superpowers, maneuvering for any kind of leverage either one can get over the other. On the one hand, Russian officials are making it very clear that American pressure to release Griner is not helpful. While on the other side, the voices and pressure get more frenetic to release her. We saw at the ESPYs, there was coverage of Griner's situation, and they did make mention of her situation with a segment dedicated to calling her, to bringing her home. While this could potentially be could be a backdrop, to her guilty plea, and at the same time, Russia has repeatedly warned Americans to stay muted on the subject regarding her plight. But that seems to have fallen on mute ears. The ESPY host, Stephen Curry, did wear a Phoenix Mercury jersey with Griner's number 42 on it, as well as other athletes who made supportive statements on Griner's behalf. It's a calculated risk for the U.S. to potentially do a prisoner swap with Russia, don't you think? On July 27th, we saw the U.S. government made it fairly clear that they were pursuing the avenue of a prisoner swap with the Russian government. And while full details of this haven't yet been released, we know and we have heard that this is likely to be Victor Bout for Griner and another American detainee. The Russian government has been fairly silent about any prisoner swap, and most of all seems to say this is speculation. So, but one, I think, should sit back and look at this and in that observe that on the one hand, releasing Victor Bout would be really an easy way to bring Griner home and end this terrible tragedy. But on the other hand, Bout is a convicted arms dealer who has ties to terrorist organizations and is accused of complacency in fueling the arms trade for wars that have cost thousands of lives. Brittney Griner is literally had a small amount of cannabis or hashish oil in her luggage. The crimes are obviously so vastly different in severity here. It's a calculated risk for the U.S. government to do this. Does it embolden other countries or groups to target Americans overseas, such as vulnerable WNBA players, in the hopes that America will do a prisoner swap? Obviously, to Brittney Griner's family, bringing her home is extremely important. She has a wife, she has a family. She is also a very sympathetic and well-liked celebrity in the US. Will the US government end up paying the price down the road for letting Victor Bout free if he resumes the arms trade? While Victor Bout may seem particularly dangerous, it's not like the flow of illicit weapons to conflict zones has stopped his imprisonment. And while Victor Bout may seem particularly dangerous, it's not like the flow of illicit weapons to conflict zones has stopped during his imprisonment. And there might also be a secret agreement with the Russian government that any release of Victor Bout includes a promise that he refrain from arms dealing or that the Russians keep him on a tighter leash. So in summary, given the disparity in pay, star power, as well as the sheer number of fans behind any NBA player, it might be appropriate to wonder if a major NBA player would be detained for months in a Russian prison if the situation were reversed for Brittney. Then again, a major NBA player makes enough money in their base salary and through commissions and endorsement deals to not have to venture to potentially repressive countries with difficult to navigate justice systems. Perhaps the real issue for us to confront then is the pay disparity in women versus men's sports in the US. After all, earlier this year, the US Soccer Federation and the US women's national team players settled a class action equal pay lawsuit for $22 million. There are a lot of caveats about this deal going into effect, which are beyond the scope of this, but it's absolutely worth mentioning here. Probably this will resolve with a prisoner swap for Brittney. Griner will plead guilty. Russia will be able to point to that as evidence of criminality. Then she will be sentenced and deported. But Russia gains nothing by keeping her locked up for years here. Griner is a high-profile celebrity athlete who seems to have just been a convenient target at a wrong place at a very, very wrong time. Even the charges themselves aren't particularly egregious. It's a drug crime. It's a drug crime. Other Americans detained for substantial lengths of time in Russia have faced criminal charges for espionage, not drugs. Given all this maneuvering, it really looks like Russia wants their guilty plea. Send Griner home as part of a prisoner swap and maybe try to get a few sanctions lifted in the meantime, all while deflecting American public interest away from the situation in the Ukraine. Thank you so very much for having me. As a lawyer who is now a certified WNBA agent, it was a true honor to go through the trial, to go through this case and provide the synopsis today. I hope it has helped.